The storm warnings had started 2 days earlier, but in a town like Edenton, North Carolina, people didn't panic easily. Hurricanes were part of life on the Atlantic coast, seasonal visitors that rattled window panes and tore shingles from roofs before moving on to the next unlucky county. On September 21, 1989, however, as Hurricane Hugo roared toward the Carolinas, even the old-timers felt a nervous tightening in their chests. The barometer was falling fast, the air tasted metallic, and the radio kept repeating the same words in an endless loop: Category 4, sustained winds, structural damage expected. Most people stayed indoors. By dusk, the downtown streets were deserted except for emergency vehicles and the occasional figure hurrying home before the first feeder bands arrived from the southeast. At 6:43 p.m., 29-year-old textile worker Marilyn Hines was seen leaving the Albemarle cotton mill, her blonde hair tied under a red kerchief, her uniform jacket buttoned tight against the rising wind. Before starting this challenging journey, I'll ask you for a small favor from the heart. Please subscribe to my channel, like this video, it costs nothing, and let me know in the comments which corner of this beautiful country you're watching me from. The mill had shut down early, its corrugated metal walls trembling under the first gusts of the hurricane's outer edge. Marilyn had been scheduled for the night shift, but the foreman, a weathered man named Chet Lawson, sent everyone home before dark. "Get out while you can," he told her, shouting over the hum of the emergency generator. "Storm's gonna tear this place in half." Marilyn smiled politely, thanked him, and clocked out at 6:45 p.m. It was the last time anyone would see her alive. Her commute home was simple: 3 miles along County Road 17, past soybean fields and the abandoned feed mill, then left onto a dirt lane that dead-ended at a small white clapboard house she shared with her younger sister June. Marilyn's Plymouth Horizon was later found parked neatly in the gravel driveway, its keys still in the ignition, the driver's side door closed but unlocked. Inside the house, a candle burned low on the kitchen counter beside an open can of peaches and a glass of sweet tea. The power had gone out sometime after 8 p.m., and June, who'd been working a shift at the hospital in Elizabeth City, returned home at midnight to find the front door banging against its frame in the wind. Marilyn was gone. At first, everyone assumed she'd taken shelter with neighbors when the storm worsened. Hugo's eye had passed inland around 2 a.m., bringing 120 miles per hour gusts that flattened barns, uprooted pecan trees, and peeled tin roofs from their nails like paper. Telephone lines were down, roads were flooded, and communication was almost impossible for 2 days. But when the floodwaters receded and rescue crews began clearing debris, Marilyn didn't reappear. Her name joined a growing list of missing persons filed across eastern North Carolina in the chaotic aftermath of the storm. Sheriff's Deputy Wendell Griggs was the first investigator assigned to the case. A soft-spoken man in his 40s with 20 years on the force, Griggs had weathered his share of domestic disputes and petty thefts, but missing persons cases were rare in Chowan County. He began by tracing Marilyn's movements on the night of the hurricane. Several co-workers confirmed she'd left the mill around 6:45 p.m., carrying her lunch pail and a canvas tote filled with sewing supplies. One recalled that Marilyn seemed distracted during her shift, staring out the window toward the river as if listening for something beyond the rising wind. Griggs canvassed the neighborhood where she lived, but the storm had erased most traces of that night. The dirt lane leading to her house was littered with broken limbs and shingles, and the field behind her property was still half underwater. No footprints, no tire marks, nothing that could tell a coherent story. Neighbors hadn't seen her, though one elderly couple claimed they'd heard a vehicle idling near the road sometime around 9 p.m. The sound, they said, was strange, not like a pickup or tractor, but more like a box truck engine straining against the wind. The days turned into weeks. The National Guard arrived to distribute aid, setting up mobile kitchens and medical tents in the high school gymnasium. Relief volunteers from as far away as Tennessee and Georgia flooded the area, offering supplies, hot meals, and manpower to rebuild what Hugo had torn apart. Among them was David L. Hargrave, a 42-year-old contractor from Raleigh who'd coordinated hurricane relief efforts for years. He was known for his easy smile, calm voice, and endless energy. People trusted him immediately: church groups, law enforcement, even the National Guard commanders who praised his organization and efficiency. Hargrave's team helped repair roofs, clear debris, and deliver bottled water to outlying communities. He became something of a local hero that fall, earning a front-page feature in the Edenton Gazette for his tireless volunteerism. What no one realized at the time was that Hargrave's arrival coincided almost exactly with the beginning of Marilyn Hines's disappearance investigation. By October, the official search had wound down. Sheriff Griggs filed his report with the state police, noting no evidence of foul play, and listing the cause as missing during natural disaster. Marilyn's sister, June, refused to accept that. She knew her sister too well. Marilyn was cautious to a fault, the kind of woman who kept an emergency flashlight in every room and a transistor radio by the bed. She wouldn't have ventured outside during a Category 4 hurricane. Something had happened to her. June began her own search, stapling flyers to utility poles, writing letters to television stations, and calling relief hotlines in case someone had seen Marilyn at a shelter. Weeks passed with no leads. She drove the backroads herself, combing through the wreckage of collapsed barns and uprooted trees, looking for any sign, clothing, footprints, a personal item, but the storm had wiped the landscape clean. When winter came, the case faded into the background noise of rural tragedy. FEMA declared the county a disaster area, the mill reopened, and people returned to rebuilding their lives. June moved to Virginia the following spring, unable to bear the empty house or the pitying looks from townspeople who whispered that her sister had probably been swept away in the flood. For the next 30 years, Marilyn Hines existed only as a name in a file cabinet at the Chowan County Sheriff's Office, buried beneath layers of dust and bureaucracy. Until 2019. It began innocuously enough, when a construction crew excavating an old storm drain near the Albemarle River uncovered what they first thought were animal remains. A human femur, weathered and pale, surfaced from the mud, followed by fragments of a jawbone with 3 intact teeth. The sheriff's department cordoned off the site, and forensic teams from Raleigh arrived 2 days later. The bones were fragile, partially mineralized from decades underground, but one item recovered near the skeleton changed everything: a rusted screw embedded in the soil beside a piece of corroded aluminum. Laboratory analysis identified the metal as part of a storm shutter bracket, the type used in the 1980s by coastal residents to secure windows before hurricanes. The screw thread contained microscopic traces of red paint and an unusual lubricant compound used in industrial applications, not residential. When technicians cleaned the bone fragments for DNA analysis, they found enough preserved material in the teeth to extract a partial genetic profile. It matched a familial DNA sample already in the state's missing persons database, submitted by June Hines in 2004. After 3 decades, Marilyn's remains had finally been found. The Cold Case Unit reopened the file under Detective Allison Vega, a seasoned investigator known for her methodical approach to long-dormant cases. Vega requested all archived evidence, including the original incident report, storm records, and volunteer rosters from Hurricane Hugo relief efforts. That's when she noticed something strange. A list of civilian contractors from 1989 included the name David L. Hargrave, and next to it, in faded typewritten notes, was a brief remark: operated blue panel truck, granted access to restricted flood zones. Vega's instincts tingled. She cross-referenced Hargrave's name with the North Carolina Department of Public Safety records and found that he died in 2012, but his nephew, Mark Hargrave, had recently submitted DNA to a genealogy database as part of a consumer ancestry test. When Vega uploaded the genetic profile for Marilyn's remains into Cody's, it produced a familial match, not to Mark directly, but to his late uncle David. The implications were staggering. It meant that at some point, the volunteer contractor who'd organized hurricane relief in Edenton had come into physical contact with Marilyn Hines, likely at the time of her death. But why? How? Vega traced Hargrave's old employment records and discovered that before his humanitarian work, he'd been an equipment operator for the state's prison system, stationed at a facility just outside of Elizabeth City in the 1970s. During that time, he'd been quietly disciplined for inappropriate contact with female staff, though the incident had been buried in personnel files and never made public. As Vega reconstructed the timeline, a chilling picture began to form. On the night of September 21, 1989, as Hugo's winds howled across eastern North Carolina, Hargrave's relief truck had been logged traveling north from Plymouth toward Edenton, hours before official deployment orders. The truck's route passed directly by County Road 17, within half a mile of where Marilyn's car was found. When Vega compared the screw thread recovered from the excavation site with surviving records from the relief organization's supply inventory, she found a perfect match. Hargrave's team had used those same industrial-grade screws for temporary storm shutters on emergency shelters. The chemical lubricant detected on the threads was a proprietary formula used by one supplier, Hargrave Contracting Incorporated. 30 years after her disappearance, the storm that had hidden Marilyn's fate was finally giving up its secrets. As Detective Vega prepared her final report for the district attorney, She drove out to the old mill site. The building was abandoned now, its windows shattered, the roof half collapsed under decades of neglect. Standing in the overgrown parking lot where Marilyn Hines had last been seen, Vega felt the same oppressive humidity that must have clung to the air that night before Hugo made landfall. The world had moved on, technology advanced, towns rebuilt, families grew old, but the ghosts of 1989 still lingered here, whispering through the rusted machinery and twisted metal. The case file that began with a single missing person report was now on the brink of rewriting the county's history. The next step would be to track down the last people who'd worked with David Hargrave during the hurricane cleanup. Some of them were still alive, scattered across the southeast, retired or relocated. One of them, Vega believed, might still remember something, a conversation, a rumor, a misplaced detail, that would finally explain how a 29-year-old textile worker vanished in the middle of a storm and why her remains were found buried beneath a storm drain designed and installed by a man the community once hailed as a hero. The rain began to fall again as Vega stood beside the cracked foundation, listening to thunder roll across the river. For a brief moment, she could almost see Marilyn walking toward her car, clutching her canvas tote, unaware that the wind at her back carried not just the storm, but the beginning of her own erasure. 30 years of silence were about to end. Detective Allison Vega had reopened enough cold cases to know that the hardest part wasn't chasing new evidence, it was navigating the ghosts of the past. Everyone had already built their own mythology around the disappearance of Marilyn Hines. Some said she'd been swept away by floodwater, others whispered about an abusive boyfriend who'd skipped town years before, and a few older residents insisted the hurricane had taken her like it took so many. But the DNA match changed everything. The quiet certainty that had allowed the town to move on began to fracture. Vega's first step was to locate the surviving members of the 1989 hurricane relief team. The roster listed 27 volunteers. 15 were confirmed deceased. Of the remaining 12, 9 agreed to interviews. Vega began in Raleigh, visiting an elderly logistics coordinator named Shirley Langford, who remembered Hargrave vividly. David wasn't like the rest of us, she told Vega, her fingers worrying the handle of her teacup. Most of us were just trying to help people get their roofs back. But he always wanted to go out alone. He said he liked to work the dangerous areas, river crossings, flood zones, places no one else would go. Thought it made him a hero. Langford described Hargrave as charming but controlling. He kept detailed logs of every truck route and insisted on personal oversight of all female volunteers. He'd flirt, but in this fatherly way that made you think he was harmless, Langford said. Then you'd realize he knew too much, your home address, your shift schedule, even your family's names. It was unsettling once you noticed. Vega took meticulous notes. When Vega visited another former volunteer, Robert Ellis, now a retired lineman in Wilmington, she noticed the same pattern. Hargrave ran the show, Ellis said. If the National Guard wanted trucks in one zone, he'd move them somewhere else. He said it was about safety, but sometimes it felt like he was hiding something. Ellis recalled that Hargrave often carried a camera and kept rolls of undeveloped film in his glove box, claiming he documented damage for FEMA. No one ever saw the photos. Vega drove north to Elizabeth City to meet June Hines, now 63, retired from nursing. June still lived alone in a tidy apartment above a pharmacy, her walls lined with faded photographs of her sister. She listened silently as Vega explained the DNA findings, her hands trembling. "I always knew," June whispered. "She wouldn't have gone out in that weather. Not Marilyn. She hated storms." When Vega mentioned Hargrave's name, June flinched. "I met him once," she said after a long pause. "A week after the hurricane. He came by the house with a clipboard, said he was checking on properties near the floodplain. He asked about Marilyn. When I told him she was missing, he looked surprised, but not shocked. I remember thinking his eyes didn't match his smile. He had this calm voice, like a preacher, but his eyes were cold." Vega's pulse quickened. It was the first verified contact between Hargrave and the victim's family. That night Vega drove out to the spot where the bones had been found. The excavation pit was now filled, the soil marked by survey flags. She crouched beside the faint depression and imagined the storm 30 years earlier, rain hammering the metal culverts, the rush of floodwater carving through soft earth, and a man in a blue truck digging hurriedly by flashlight, wind screaming around him. A place like this would have been chaos during Hugo. No one would have noticed one more man working beside a drainage ditch. Back at her office, Vega spread every file across the table: the 1989 witness statements, volunteer rosters, FEMA reports, and newspaper clippings. One document stood out: a handwritten log entry from the Albemarle Relief Command dated September 22, 1989, 2:14 a.m., listing Hargrave's truck as in field, Edenton sector, flood survey. But the county's meteorological records placed sustained 100 miles per hour winds at that exact hour. No civilian vehicles should have been operating. The next breakthrough came from an unexpected source: a retired storm engineer named Miles O'Connor, who'd worked with Hargrave during the cleanup. Vega found him in a veteran's home outside New Bern. His memory was sharp despite his age. Hargrave was clever, O'Connor told her. He'd claimed to reinforce damaged houses, but he was really scavenging materials: metal brackets, screws, anything he could sell later. We caught him once stripping siding off a condemned property. He laughed it off, said he was recycling. O'Connor leaned closer. He was obsessed with that girl who went missing. I heard him mention her name. Vega froze. You heard him say her name? Yeah. We were loading supplies. He told one of the guys she'd made a mistake walking out in that wind. I thought he was talking about someone from the paper, one of the victims. Now I'm not so sure. Vega drove back to Raleigh through sheets of rain, her mind racing. The physical evidence, the timeline, the behavioral reports, they all converged on one possibility. Marilyn Hines had encountered Hargrave the night of the hurricane, likely when her power failed. He could have offered help, claiming to be part of early relief patrols. Once inside her home, something had gone wrong. To confirm it, Vega needed hard evidence. She requested an inventory of Hargrave's estate, long since closed after his death. Most of his belongings had been auctioned, but a few boxes of documents were still held in storage by his surviving nephew Mark. When Vega visited him, Mark seemed nervous but cooperative. Uncle David was a good man, he insisted. Everybody said so. He helped after Hugo. He helped after Andrew down in Florida. Why are you digging this up? Vega explained the DNA match, watching his face pale. Together they opened the storage unit, a corrugated locker smelling of dust and motor oil. Inside were labeled crates, relief work, personal photos, equipment receipts. Vega's heart pounded as she sifted through the brittle folders. In one, she found storm shutter schematics identical to the metal fragment recovered with Marilyn's remains. Another folder contained handwritten route logs that placed Hargrave near County Road 17 on the night she vanished. But it was a small Polaroid envelope that froze her completely. Inside were 12 photographs. Most showed hurricane damage, flattened houses, wrecked cars, flood debris. But one image was different: a young woman in a red kerchief standing beside a mill gate, sunlight catching her hair. The timestamp on the back read September 21, 89, 6:42 p.m. The same evening Marilyn had clocked out of the Albemarle mill. Vega stared at the photo until her vision blurred. There was no mistaking the subject. Hargrave had photographed Marilyn moments before she disappeared. The evidence was overwhelming, but Vega needed corroboration. She called June, describing the photograph carefully without revealing too much. That's her, June said, her voice shaking. She wore that scarf every shift. He must have followed her from work. Vega contacted the state attorney's office. Even though Hargrave was dead, they prepared a formal report designating the case closed by exceptional means, solved posthumously through DNA and photographic evidence. But Vega couldn't stop. Something about the timeline still bothered her. She returned to the excavation site one final time, bringing ground-penetrating radar. Beneath the filled-in soil, technicians located an anomaly, another metallic mass about 6 feet from the original find. When they unearthed it, they discovered the corroded remains of a metal toolbox. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, lay fragments of a woman's watch, a cracked plastic ID badge from the Albemarle mill, and a single screw identical to those Hargrave's company had supplied. The storm had hidden everything for decades, but Hugo's fury had also preserved the evidence by sealing it under layers of sediment. By the time Vega drove back to Raleigh, the sun had dipped low behind the pines, casting long shadows across the highway. She thought of June Hines, waiting for the call that would finally end 30 years of not knowing. She thought of the quiet factory towns still scattered along the river, where every passing storm might stir up another secret buried by wind and water. When Vega filed her final statement, She wrote a single line that stood apart from the official narrative: "Sometimes the storm doesn't destroy the evidence. It hides it, waiting for someone patient enough to listen to the wind." Detective Allison Vega hadn't expected the investigation to stay with her after the file closed, but the more she thought about the Hargrave name, the more it began to fester. Officially, the case was solved, DNA confirmed, timeline reconstructed, the photograph sealing it. The state attorney's office called it a posthumous confession written in evidence. But for Vega, there was something about the neatness of it that felt wrong. Crimes that hid for 30 years rarely resolved so cleanly. Especially when the perpetrator had built his reputation on charity and civic pride. The morning after she filed her final report, Vega received an envelope in her departmental mailbox with no return address. Inside was a faded photocopy of a 1978 Chowan County newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Local Youth Dies in Flood Channel Accident." The victim's name was Anna Lee Cooper, age 17. According to the article, Anna had drowned while helping her father clear debris after a tropical storm. The piece was sympathetic, until Vega noticed the byline at the bottom: photography by David L. Hargrave. Her pulse quickened. She checked the date, August 5, 1978, 11 years before Marilyn Hines vanished. Another storm. Another young woman. The archive room of the Edenton Public Library smelled of mildew and microfilm. Vega loaded the spool and scrolled through decades of headlines: crop yields, factory closures, high school football scores. She found Hargrave's name dozens of times, always attached to local disaster coverage. Flood rescues, house fires, missing hikers. Each event featured his photographs, always documenting victims, often young women. The tone of the article suggested admiration, even hero worship. Hargrave braved the storm for the perfect shot. Hargrave captures the human spirit amid tragedy. But there was something almost ritualistic in the repetition: storm, loss, camera, Hargrave. Vega printed every clipping. Back at her office, she spread them across the floor, arranging them chronologically. The pattern was unmistakable. Between 1978 and 1992, at least 5 major disasters struck the coastal counties, each covered by Hargrave, each involving a missing or deceased young woman. The official causes varied: drowning, car accidents, debris injuries. But when Vega cross-checked police records, she found that 3 of those women's remains had never been recovered. She called the state medical examiner's office. "Do you have DNA profiles on file for any unsolved missing persons from flood events prior to 1990? She asked. The technician hesitated. "We've got a few partials, mostly from family submissions." "What's the connection?" Vega didn't answer. She just gave him the names. The results came back a week later. Of the 3 missing women, one, Amy Jo Whitley, who disappeared after the 1984 Albemarle River flood, had a family DNA sample on record. The lab technician called late Friday evening, his voice tight with disbelief. "Detective, we've got a partial match. Familial connection between the Whitley sample and the Hargrave DNA profile from the Hines case. Not direct, but consistent with paternal lineage." Vega felt the air leave her lungs. It meant that biological material, trace DNA recovered from one of the flood sites in 1984, contained genetic markers tied to the same family that had produced David Hargrave. She reopened the Whitley file. Amy Jo was 19, last seen leaving her part-time job at a riverside diner as flood warnings blared over the radio. Her car was found half-submerged near a bridge. No body. No evidence. No resolution. The case had been closed within weeks, attributed to extreme weather event casualty. Vega drove to the diner, now long abandoned, its parking lot cracked and overgrown. A faded sign still read Fisherman's Landing, homemade pies and hot coffee. Inside, mold crept across the walls. She found the window where Amy Jo had likely watched the storm roll in. Outside, the river glimmered dull and wide, swollen by recent rains. It was easy to imagine a young woman locking up for the night, stepping into the downpour, headlights reflecting off the water, and a man offering help. A man with a camera. She began digging through Hargrave's old photo archives. Mark, the nephew, had turned over boxes of negatives to the state after Vega's last visit. Most were landscapes, storm damage, humanitarian snapshots. But when Vega viewed them under magnification, she noticed something chilling. In several frames, Hargrave's truck appeared in the background, always parked near the locations where women later went missing. The camera hadn't captured coincidence. It had documented his presence, his trophies. Vega compiled a timeline spanning 30 years, overlaying storm data, Hargrave's assignments, and missing persons reports. The overlap was almost perfect. He'd used natural disasters as camouflage, chaos as cover for abduction. Every hurricane, every flood, every storm was an opportunity. Still, she needed corroboration from someone who'd known him intimately. Through personnel records, Vega tracked down Elaine Porter, a retired emergency coordinator who'd worked with Hargrave during multiple relief operations. Elaine lived in a nursing home outside Greenville, her memory clouded but her wit intact. When Vega showed her Hargrave's photograph, she shuddered. He was a good organizer, she said softly, but there was something off about how he talked about the storms. Said they were cleansing. Said nature made people honest. Once he told me the wind made everyone equal, because no one could hide. She closed her eyes. I didn't understand then what he meant. Vega's hands shook as she wrote the statement. It was the kind of philosophical detachment she'd seen in interviews with serial offenders, predators who justified their crimes as acts of nature. Hargrave hadn't just killed during Hurricane Hugo. He'd been cultivating his opportunities for years. She presented her findings to the State Cold Case Task Force. The room was silent as she described the pattern, the familial DNA, the photographic evidence. A senior analyst finally spoke. Are you suggesting Hargrave could be responsible for multiple homicides spanning decades? I'm not suggesting, Vega said. I'm documenting. They reopened the Whitley and Cooper files for comparative analysis. The remains from both cases had long since been lost to time or buried without identification, but Vega pushed for exhumations of unidentified storm victims buried in the region's potter's fields. Over the following months, forensic teams uncovered 2 skeletons matching the ages and builds of the missing women. Both carried trace evidence of industrial screw threads identical to the one found near Marilyn's remains. It was enough. The state reclassified the cases as serial homicide under environmental disaster concealment. The phrase sounded clinical, but its meaning was devastating. David Hargrave hadn't been a hero. He'd been a pattern hidden in the weather. Reporters swarmed Edenton when the story broke. Storm Angel turns killer, one headline screamed. Families of the victims gathered for a press conference at the county courthouse. June Hines sat in the front row, her sister's photograph in her lap. When Vega entered, June stood, walked over, and hugged her silently. Neither woman spoke. As the weeks passed, more stories surfaced. Former volunteers recalled strange requests from Hargrave, assignments that sent women to isolated sites for supply verification, routes that conveniently passed flood channels or abandoned barns. A FEMA coordinator admitted that Hargrave had manipulated paperwork to gain unrestricted access to disaster zones. The logistics network he'd built to save lives had doubled as a private hunting ground. Vega's superiors commended her work, but she couldn't celebrate. Every discovery made the air heavier. The deeper she delved, the more she realized how easily Hargrave had hidden behind goodness. He'd worn his virtue like a storm coat, impermeable and clean, while everything beneath it rotted. Late one evening, Vega sat in her darkened office, reading Hargrave's old letters found among his estate papers. One line stood out, written in neat cursive: "Storms reveal what the world tries to hide. You just have to know where to look." She closed the file slowly, aware that his words weren't a metaphor. They were a confession. In the months that followed, Edenton changed. The old mill was razed, the field where Marilyn's car had sat turned into a memorial garden for hurricane victims. Locals left flowers every September, though few spoke about the truth behind the tragedy. The town preferred its myths tidy, its ghosts silent. Detective Vega knew silence was dangerous. She kept copies of every photograph, every report, every unsolved name that had crossed Hargrave's path. Somewhere among those files, she suspected, were other faces, women whose disappearances were still listed as storm casualties, their deaths misfiled under acts of God. But Vega had learned that God wasn't the one making the weather. People were. She drove one last time to the Albemarle River Bridge, the wind rustling the reeds, thunder low in the distance. The water glimmered black under the clouds. Somewhere beneath it lay decades of forgotten truth, screws, bones, fragments of fabric. As she stood there, her phone buzzed. A message from the forensic lab. New partial DNA hit. From 1984 flood site, requesting confirmation. The storm hadn't finished talking yet. By spring 2020, the Hargrave case had already become legend in the North Carolina law enforcement community. A ghost story detectives told each other about the killer who hid inside hurricanes. But Detective Allison Vega wasn't done. The new partial DNA hit mentioned in that short text message arrived from the state lab on a rainy Tuesday morning, and it would drag her back into the same floodwater she thought she'd escaped. The sample came from a 1984 flood debris box catalogued during the Whitley investigation. The chain of custody log was almost unreadable, the handwriting faded by time and humidity. The box had been sitting in a state warehouse for 36 years, marked miscellaneous non-evidentiary. Inside were fragments of fabric, 2 pieces of aluminum siding, and a sealed envelope labeled Site B, Riverbend Apartments. The new analyst had decided to test it simply because Vega's recent reports mentioned industrial lubricant compounds on screw threads, and this envelope had similar residue. The DNA profile extracted from a minute blood flake on the fabric didn't belong to Hargrave himself, but it matched a woman named Clara Reeves, who, according to FEMA's 1984 casualty list, had drowned in the same flood that took Amy Jo Whitley. Except she hadn't drowned. Clara Reeves was alive. The database crossmatch came through because Clara, now 62, had recently submitted her DNA to an ancestry site as part of a genealogy project. Her profile had been auto-flagged by the state lab's cold case comparison software. It was an impossibility, a living woman's genetic material recovered from a crime scene officially attributed to a natural disaster. Vega checked twice, then called the number listed on Clara's registration. Mrs. Reeves? This is Detective Allison Vega, North Carolina Cold Case Unit. I'm calling about an old incident from 1984. I believe you may have been listed as deceased in our records. There was a long silence, then a soft laugh that didn't sound amused. Detective, I've been waiting 36 years for someone to figure that out. 2 days later Vega drove west through sheets of coastal rain to meet her in person. Clara lived in a weather-beaten farmhouse near the Pasquotank River, her porch sagging, her yard overtaken by cattails. She met Vega at the door with a limp and eyes that seemed to see 2 timelines at once. Inside, the house smelled of cedar and rain. They told everyone I drowned, Clara said, settling into a chair. I let them. My family thought I was gone. But I didn't want to come back. Not after what he did. Vega's recorder clicked on. You're talking about David Hargrave. Clara nodded slowly. Back then, he was with the County Relief Board. He came around after the flood, said he was checking basements for electrical hazards. I just lost everything, house flooded, husband in jail for drunk driving. I didn't question kindness. He said he'd drive me to the shelter in Edenton. We never made it there. Her voice faltered. He took me to some building near the river. Said it was a supply depot. I remember the smell, oil, wet metal, like machinery. He asked me questions, the kind that didn't make sense. Did anyone know where I was? Was anyone expecting me? When I said no, he smiled. That smile was wrong, detective. He locked the door. Vega felt her stomach twist. Clara continued, voice trembling but steady. He tied me up with electrical cord. Said the storm washed everything clean, that no one would come looking for a woman already marked dead. I fought him. I broke a window, cut my arm, ran into the floodwater. I remember the current pulling me down. Then I woke up miles away, tangled in reeds. I hitchhiked north and never told a soul. Figured if I stayed gone, he'd think I'd died. Guess he did. For hours Vega listened as Clara pieced together the night, the building, the truck, the industrial lubricant on the door latches, the same compound found on the screws by Marilyn's remains. It was the missing bridge between decades of suspicion and confirmation. Hargrave hadn't started with Marilyn. He'd refined his methods over years, practicing abduction and concealment under the cover of storms. Clara had escaped before his process perfected. When Vega asked why she'd never reported it, Clara looked at her with weary disbelief. You think anyone in 1984 was going to believe a poor woman who'd lost everything, saying the county's golden boy tried to kill her? They'd have said I was hysterical. Better to stay dead. Vega left the farmhouse shaken. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the air thick and still. She sat in her car, voice recording her impressions before they faded, subject credible. Physical scars on left wrist consistent with electrical cord restraints. Trauma recall specific. Mentions odor compounds matching known evidence. The next step was to verify the location Clara described. Using flood maps from 1984, Vega traced potential supply depots along the riverbank. One structure matched perfectly, an abandoned utilities warehouse condemned after the storm, later purchased by none other than Hargrave Contracting Incorporated in 1986. The deed transfer listed David Hargrave as owner. When Vega arrived on site with a forensic team, the building looked ready to collapse. Corrugated steel walls bowed inward, rust blooming in streaks. Inside, mud coated the floor like dried blood. But near the back wall, hidden behind a false panel of rotted plywood, they found something remarkable, a storm shutter assembly jig, still bolted to the concrete. The screws on the frame bore identical tool marks to those recovered with Marilyn Hines's remains. Under the jig was a shallow pit filled with debris, scraps of canvas, fragments of bone too small for immediate identification, and the remnants of a red kerchief, faded almost to pink. Vega stared at it until her vision blurred. Whether it belonged to Marilyn or one of the earlier victims, it was proof that Hargrave had used this site as both workshop and graveyard. News of the discovery leaked within days. Reporters swarmed the property, calling it the Hurricane Depot. Locals gathered outside the yellow tape, faces pale with disbelief. Many had known Hargrave personally. Some had served with him in church committees or civic groups. The idea that their volunteer savior had used the same hands that passed out blankets to bury women alive broke something fundamental in the town's psyche. Meanwhile, Vega persuaded Clara Reeves to come forward publicly. The press conference was held in the county courthouse where Hargrave had once received an award for community service. Clara stood behind the podium, voice trembling but clear. "He didn't just take lives," she said. "He took storms meant for everyone and made them his own. He used disaster like camouflage. But the storm kept the evidence. It waited." Her words spread across national headlines. For a brief moment, the story became more than a local cold case. It became a symbol of the dark spaces ordinary men could carve inside catastrophe. FEMA ordered an internal review of volunteer vetting practices. The state legislature reopened oversight hearings about civilian disaster response networks. Yet amid all the bureaucratic aftershocks, Vega kept chasing details. She obtained a search warrant for Hargrave's surviving property records and uncovered one last chilling thread. In 1990, a year after Marilyn's disappearance, Hargrave had purchased a small tract of marshland along the Pasquotank River. The deed described it as flood mitigation property. Satellite imagery revealed a shallow depression shaped unnaturally symmetrical, like a pond deliberately excavated. When the dive team entered the murky water, they surfaced fragments of fabric, an identification badge belonging to Amy Jo Whitley, and a rusted camera tripod. The river had swallowed the evidence for 30 years, but the storm had preserved it in silt. That night Vega couldn't sleep. She replayed Clara's trembling voice, the echo of the storm jig rattling in the warehouse, the camera tripod glinting under the floodlights. She realized that every discovery had come because the hurricane itself had shifted the earth, rearranging secrets Hargrave thought he'd buried forever. Before dawn, Vega sat at her desk writing what she called the psychological autopsy of David Hargrave. It wasn't for the case file, it was for herself. She wrote, "He built storms around himself because storms don't answer questions. They erase timelines, blur witnesses, and wash away footprints. He didn't just hide inside the hurricane, he became it." His victims weren't chosen at random. They were women alone in transition, widows, students, sisters, workers. The ones storms leave behind. He offered help, and when the world looked away, he became their last witness. Every hurricane gave him permission to start again. By morning she had filled 20 pages. She closed the notebook and slipped it into her drawer. The department would file reports, journalists would chase interviews, but what mattered was that the ghosts had names again. In June 2020, a memorial was held at the rebuilt Edenton Pier. June Hines stood with Clara Reeves, the two women bound by storm and survival. When the minister read the list of names, the wind rose from the river, lifting the paper from his hands and scattering it into the water. People gasped, but Vega thought it fitting. The wind had carried the truth before, now it carried their release. That night, lightning flashed far out at sea. Vega watched from her car, headlights off, the rain whispering against the windshield. She wondered how many other towns had men like Hargrave buried beneath their reputations, waiting for another storm to dig them out. She turned the key, the engine hummed, and she whispered into the dark, "Let the wind talk. I'll listen." By autumn of 2020, Edenton had become something of a pilgrimage site for journalists, criminologists, and self-styled storm chasers obsessed with the Hargrave case. They came to photograph the pier, to interview anyone who'd once known the Hurricane Samaritan, to stand in the places where the wind had swallowed entire lives. But for Detective Allison Vega, the frenzy felt hollow. The world loved neat monsters, the lone predator, the solved mystery, the cautionary headline. The truth she was uncovering refused to fit that shape. Hargrave hadn't operated in a vacuum. Vega had started to suspect that long before his crimes reached their apex, someone, or several someones, had looked the other way. In November, she was summoned to Raleigh to brief the State Disaster Response Committee, a panel of politicians eager to appear diligent in the wake of public outrage. Most of them wanted reassurance that Hargrave's predations were an anomaly. Vega didn't give it to them. She laid out the evidence: the falsified logs, the manipulated volunteer credentials, the warehouse property purchased under state contracts. "He didn't just exploit a system," she said. "He was the system. You built it around him." A week later, an anonymous email appeared in Vega's inbox. The subject line read, "You're not done yet." Attached was a single photograph, grainy black and white, showing a group of FEMA field agents standing in front of a temporary communications trailer during Hurricane Emily, 1993. Among them was David Hargrave, smiling, headset around his neck, clipboard in hand. The caption scrawled in the corner read, "Audio archives exist, Region 3 HQ." Vega knew what that meant. FEMA's regional offices had maintained analog radio tapes of all emergency transmissions before the digital era. If Hargrave had continued volunteering beyond 1989, his voice might still exist on those reels. It could prove that he'd been active years after Marilyn Hines' murder, possibly even posthumously linked to other disappearances misclassified as storm fatalities. The tapes were stored at a decommissioned logistics facility in Richmond, Virginia. The building was cold and windowless, its corridors echoing with the hum of ancient fluorescent lights. The clerk at the front desk looked startled when Vega presented her credentials. "Those archives haven't been touched in 20 years, he said. "Half the boxes are mislabeled. Most of the tapes are degraded." She signed the access log anyway. Rows upon rows of cardboard boxes lined the storage room, each marked with a storm name and year. Emily, Fran, Opal, Floyd. Vega began with the Emily box. Inside were spools of magnetic tape, their reels rusted, the labels handwritten in fading marker. Team 6 Command, Edenton Sector, September 2, 93. Her pulse quickened. Edenton again. 4 years after Marilyn's death. Back in Raleigh, the Forensic Audio Lab managed to restore the recordings. Hours of static and chatter filled the speakers, routine rescue operations, calls for medical assistance, logistical updates. Then, 47 minutes into one tape, a voice emerged, clear despite the distortion. "Sector 4, this is Hargrave, confirming West Route secured. 2 civilian female evacuees relocated to shelter base, requesting supply clearance. Over." Vega froze. The timestamp placed the transmission at September 2, 1993, 22:19 hours. The operator on the other end responded, "Copy, Hargrave. Log their names." But the reply never came. The line cut abruptly, followed by a burst of static. Vega scrubbed through the rest of the reel. Nothing. No follow-up, no confirmation. When she cross-referenced FEMA's official logs for that night, the entry for Sector 4 West Route was blank. The 2 civilian female evacuees were never identified. She felt the old chill return, the same electric dread she'd felt the first time she saw Marilyn's photograph. Hargrave's pattern hadn't ended in 1989. He'd evolved, embedding himself deeper into the bureaucratic fabric of disaster response. The next logical step was to locate the original shelter base referenced in the recording. FEMA maps from 1993 listed it as Temporary Shelter 4A, located inside a high school gymnasium in Carteret County. Vega drove down 2 days later. The building still stood, converted now into a storage depot for municipal equipment. The janitor, an elderly man named Frank Weller, remembered the storm well. We had hundreds in here, he said. The wind peeled the roof like a sardine can. One of the volunteers kept trying to move women into the side rooms, said they'd be safer there. I told him no. Damn fool kept insisting. Do you remember his name? Vega asked. He frowned, digging through memory. Hargrave. Yeah, that was it. The one always carrying that camera. Thought he was FEMA brass. That night, Vega found herself sitting in a motel room near the coast, watching the rain streak down the window, playing the tape again and again. She could hear it now, the calm professionalism in his tone, the subtle control. The predator had learned to sound like command authority. And 2 more women had vanished into the wind. But the tapes had another secret. On the final reel, recorded 2 nights after the first, an operator's voice came through faintly. Command, this is Base 4A. Civilian evacuees unaccounted for from Hargrave transport. Requesting update. Silence. Then a different male voice, not Hargrave's, responded. Negative, Base. Hargrave transferred to HQ this morning. File complete. Do not pursue. The voice was familiar. Vega replayed it until the syllables etched themselves into her skull. She checked old personnel rosters from 1993 and found a perfect match. Deputy Coordinator Alan P. Rourke, Regional FEMA Supervisor and Hargrave's direct superior. If Rourke had closed the file, he had effectively erased the disappearance from federal records. When Vega tracked him down, he was retired, living in Florida, 81 years old and frail but lucid. He greeted her on his porch, eyes narrowing at her badge. I figured this would come around eventually, he said. Over black coffee, he admitted what no one else would. Hargrave was useful, Rourke said flatly. He knew how to get into places, how to calm people down. And when evacuees went missing, it was easy to write it off. You think I didn't notice the patterns? I did. But try telling Washington you suspect your star volunteer's a killer. They'd bury you under paperwork. Did you help him? Vega asked quietly. Rourke looked away. No. But I didn't stop him either. And after the '93 storm, he disappeared. Said he was transferring to private relief work overseas. I didn't ask questions. That's my sin. Vega left without shaking his hand. Back in Raleigh, she prepared an addendum to the official report. The findings were damning: the FEMA audio logs, the vanished evacuees, Rourke's recorded statement. It wasn't just a serial predator, it was systemic neglect. Disasters had provided Hargrave cover, but bureaucracy had given him invisibility. The addendum leaked within a week. National outlets ran the story under headlines like Storm Cover-Up Exposed and Federal Negligence Enabled Killer. Congressional hearings were announced. FEMA issued a statement promising transparency and reform. For Vega, none of it felt like victory. The noise of political outrage drowned out the quiet truth. 2 women from 1993 still had no names, no graves. Late one evening, a call came from the forensic lab. A technician, voice shaky with excitement, reported a discovery. The lubricants found on the storm shutter screws and warehouse tools matched residue from medical-grade disinfectant used in field morgues during disaster recovery. That meant Hargrave had access to bodies before burial. He hadn't just killed, he'd experimented, staging false drownings to test his methods of concealment. That revelation shattered what little distance Vega had left between herself and the case. She began dreaming of storms again, the wind screaming like a siren, the rain turning into a curtain of ash, voices whispering through the static of old radios. Every dream ended with the same sound, a reel-to-reel tape spinning endlessly, whispering her name. In December 2020, she returned to the Edenton Memorial one last time. The pier was empty, the wind sharp. She carried a small envelope containing one of the original audio tape fragments, now cleaned and preserved. She tossed it into the river, watching it sink beneath the ripples. The storm, she thought, had kept its own archive. It didn't need another. As she turned to leave, her phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. You found his voice. Now find the others. Attached was a scan document, Relief Deployment Log, Puerto Rico, 1995, Coordinator, D.L. Hargrave. The wind off the water lifted her hair like fingers. The storm wasn't over. It had only changed its name. The scanned document arrived in Vega's inbox without metadata, no sender, no traceable source. It bore a FEMA watermark, dated October 1995, with the black letters Operation Renew, Puerto Rico Hurricane Relief. The signature at the bottom stopped her breath. David L. Hargrave, Logistics Coordinator, Volunteer Division. According to every file she'd seen, Hargrave had died in 2012, after decades of service confined to the U.S. mainland. But here was evidence that 6 years after his last confirmed transmission in North Carolina, he had resurfaced under official authority in an overseas relief mission. For a long time, Vega stared at the image glowing on her laptop, listening to the hum of her office's fluorescent lights. The sound was like static, like the hiss between Hargrave's old radio transmissions. If the document was genuine, it meant two things. Someone in the federal relief hierarchy had knowingly reinstated Hargrave despite suspicions about him. His reach extended beyond the Carolina coast, maybe even beyond U.S. jurisdiction. She printed the page and locked it in her evidence drawer. Then she called the only person who might help her untangle the international threads, Special Agent Thomas Arroyo, with the Department of Homeland Security's Office of Inspector General. Arroyo had been following the case since Vega's first reports hit national news. He met her 2 days later in a Wilmington diner, sliding a manila folder across the table before his coffee even cooled. "You didn't get this from me," he said. Inside were copies of deployment manifests from the 1995 Puerto Rico relief mission after Hurricane Marilyn, the same storm that had devastated the island weeks before the supposed Operation Renew. Hargrave's name appeared twice, once on a supply requisition form, and again on a handwritten personnel roster with a note beside it, Field Team Bravo, independent contractor status cleared by HQ. "That roster's not in the public FEMA archive," Vega said. "Because it was scrubbed," Arroyo replied. "After the internal reviews you triggered last year, we found dozens of relief contractor files missing. Most were simple clerical errors. But Hargrave's wasn't. His personnel code was reissued in 1994, to someone listed as Daniel L. Harris." She felt her pulse slow, her stomach drop. "He changed his identity?" Arroyo nodded. "And someone helped him do it. We traced payroll vouchers from that period to a private logistics firm subcontracted through FEMA, American Humanitarian Solutions, based out of Atlanta. The company dissolved in 1999, but its board included a former regional coordinator named Alan Rourke. The name hung in the air like thunder. Rourke, the same superior who had confessed to ignoring Hargrave's disappearances. "He didn't just look the other way," Vega said. "He gave him a passport." Arroyo's eyes darkened. "If you want to go further with this, you're leaving state jurisdiction behind. There's no official investigation open. You'll be on your own." "I've been on my own since 1989, Vega said. 2 weeks later, Vega arrived in San Juan under the pretext of consulting on hurricane logistics reform. Officially, she was a guest lecturer. Unofficially, she was retracing Hargrave's last known footprints. The city was humid and restless, rebuilt in layers of concrete and memory. At the central FEMA office, a young archivist led her to a basement filled with yellowed boxes labeled Maryland 1995 Relief. Dust and salt hung in the air. Vega sorted through stacks of damaged manifests until one file caught her eye: casualty reports, outlying zones. It listed 23 deaths attributed to flooding near the coastal town of Arecibo. Among them were 3 unidentified women, ages estimated between 20 and 30, noted simply as found near relief compound perimeter. No autopsies. No next of kin. She drove to Arecibo that afternoon, following the narrow coastal road that hugged the cliffs. The old relief compound had long been abandoned, a cluster of concrete huts half swallowed by jungle. Inside the main structure, graffiti covered the walls, but faint stenciled letters still read, "Field Bravo Supply Unit." It was exactly as described on the Puerto Rico roster. Vega pushed deeper into the building, flashlight cutting through the gloom. The smell of mildew mixed with something chemical, acrid. Behind a row of toppled shelves, she found a rusted metal table bolted to the floor, its surface pitted with corrosion. A small camera tripod lay beneath it, identical to the one recovered from the Pasquotank River. Beside it, wedged into a crack in the concrete, was a single screw, industrial grade, threaded with red residue. She crouched to pick it up, turning it under the beam of light. The red wasn't rust. It was paint. She knew that color. The same shade that had once coated the storm shutters of Marilyn Hines's little white house in North Carolina. That night, Vega sat in a cheap motel room overlooking the sea, the air thick with humidity and dread. She recorded her field notes aloud, voice flat, methodical, recovered sight consistent with Hargrave's known modus operandi. Evidence of makeshift containment structures. Chemical odor matches solvent used in industrial disinfectant, identical to compound from 1989 and 1993 sites. Visual confirmation of mechanical fixture consistent with storm jig design. Then, after a long silence, she added, "He kept building." She barely slept. The ocean outside sounded like breathing, deep, rhythmic, endless. At dawn she returned to the site with local police, but the overnight tide had surged, submerging the lower level. The screw was gone. The sea had reclaimed its piece of the story. Back in San Juan, Vega filed a preliminary report to DHS. But when she returned to her hotel, her room door was ajar. Inside, her suitcase was untouched, except for the manila folder Arroyo had given her. It was gone. In its place lay a single Polaroid photograph face down on the bed. She turned it over carefully. It showed the Arecibo coastline from above, taken from a helicopter. In the corner, written in red ink, "Storms Remember." There was no signature. For the next 48 hours, Vega moved like someone being watched. She checked out of the hotel, switched phones twice, and sent coded updates to Arroyo using secure channels. He responded once, "Come home. Files compromised. Someone inside DHS blocking data access." She booked the next flight back to North Carolina. But the story refused to stay buried. Within weeks, a journalist from the Charlotte Ledger published a leaked excerpt from an internal FEMA audit citing unresolved fatalities linked to unverified field contractor Daniel L. Harris, Puerto Rico, 1995. The story exploded online, reigniting the scandal Vega had barely contained. Congressional hearings reopened, demanding her testimony. When she appeared before the committee, cameras flashing, she said only this: David Hargrave used storms to erase his crimes. But he didn't work alone. Every unchecked box, every unverified name, every lost form gave him another life to take. The wind didn't protect him. We did. Her words echoed through the chamber, then into silence. Months passed. Vega resigned from the sheriff's department and took a quiet position teaching criminal forensics at East Carolina University. Her lectures always began the same way: every crime scene is a kind of weather system. It changes shape depending on how long you stare at it. But even in retirement, the storms followed her. One evening in late 2021, while grading papers in her office, she received a padded envelope with no return address. Inside was a microcassette recorder, the kind used in the 1990s for field documentation. She pressed play. A man's voice, distorted by age and static, filled the room. Calm, precise, unmistakable. "This is Field Bravo. 2 subjects relocated. Floodwaters rising. Containment proceeding as planned. Stormfall ETA 2 hours. After that, no one will find anything." Then silence. Vega sat motionless, the tape whirring to its end. She recognized the tone, not frantic, not hurried. Almost reverent. The voice of a man who believed the storm was his accomplice. When she checked the envelope again, she found one more item folded inside: a weathered map of the Caribbean, red circles drawn across the islands, St. Croix, Dominica, Jamaica, Cuba, and one word scrawled across the bottom margin: next. Hargrave was dead. But his system, the machinery of unchecked volunteers and invisible victims, had survived him. Someone had inherited his storm. Vega placed the cassette in an evidence bag, sealed it, and locked it away. Then she walked out into the night air. The wind was rising again, carrying the faint electric scent that always came before a hurricane. Somewhere out over the Atlantic, thunder rolled. She whispered to the darkness, not as an investigator, but as a witness: the storm never ends. It only changes its shape. Lightning split the horizon, and the rain began. Before starting this challenging journey, I'll ask you for a small favor from the heart. Please subscribe to my channel, like this video, it costs nothing, and let me know in the comments which corner of this beautiful country you're watching me from.